Remember a few weeks ago when we watched This Extraordinary Being? As a reminder, that was the black and white episode all about Will Reeves. Remember how you felt while watching it? That feeling that, this is one of the best episodes of television you've ever seen. I bet when you watched that, if you're anything like me, you weren't thinking that it might not even be the best episode of this season. Watchmen Season 1, Episode 8, the penultimate episode of the first and possibly only season of Watchmen, entitled A God Walks Into Abar, as in Angela Abar, but obviously a play on the old so-and-so walks into a bar jokes. By the way, I'm having LASIK eye surgery a few hours from now, so if I go blind or I get killed or anything like that, a laser explodes my head, this episode will be my opus. Do me a favor and rate, review, subscribe so I can at least bump those numbers up in memoriam. I appreciate that. Now, for those familiar with the comic books or the movie, there's a particular chapter where Dr. Manhattan takes Laurie to Mars and he tries to explain to her, how he sees time. Now, this was very much a play on that style of storytelling, and it reminded me of something I heard somewhere along the way, that each episode of the show matches up with each chapter of the Watchmen comics. I never really looked into it too much. It's something I have to do. Obviously, I read the comics. I own the comics, so it's just literally a matter of referencing and going back and seeing all that. But I haven't done it yet, so I don't know if I remember to do it, I'll do it for the finale. I'm sure there's a place to look that up to see if that actually fits. It's just something that just popped into my head because I heard it somewhere along the way on this journey. But let's get into this wild episode and try to make sense of it. Right, we open up on Dr. Manhattan walking through the streets of Vietnam during yet another VVN Day celebration, years after the one with the terrorist attack. I want to say 21 years, 23 years, something like that. He picks up a Dr. Manhattan mask and walks into a bar where he meets Angela Abar. Kind of a cool thing there, where the title of the episode appears in the scene, as it normally does with all these episodes. But in this case, Dr. Manhattan walks right through it, just like he can walk through walls. The attention to detail in the show, it's seriously, it's off the charts, man. I love the fat dude dressed as Dr. Manhattan, shooting the real Dr. Manhattan a look as he kind of walks in, by the way. Like, wow, that's a pretty good costume, man. Like, that's kind of what his face says. I just like that little humor right in the beginning of the episode. Now, the conversation he has with Angela in this bar is a recurring thread that kind of holds the whole episode together, at least until the final scene back in present day. Actually, it's not even true because it ends with that bar scene again. So that's kind of the through line throughout this episode. But damn, I have to say, I sang his praises a lot. I understand that I'm very biased. I'm a huge fan of his. But the way Damon Lindelof told this story specifically, this weaving tale of timelines and the future influencing the past and everything that goes with that, I mean, it was brilliant. It was so truly just brilliantly written. It really was. Like, a recap wouldn't do it justice. So I'm not going to even try, really. You guys should be the ones who rewatch it. Even if you're not someone who rewatches episodes, I highly suggest you rewatch this specific episode, just how perfect all the dialogue is in this scene, because it's just something I can't recreate in this format, this sort of recap format. Regina King is amazing, by the way, quickly becoming one of my favorite actresses. But instead of focusing on, the brilliant dialogue, for the sake of this companion podcast, let's dive deeper into the reveals and the actual plot points. For one, this isn't Dr. Manhattan on Mars all this time, right? We see the news broadcast. It's referenced that he's on Mars. That's not true. It's actually a recording of Dr. Manhattan used to be a decoy. Why? Well, because the real Dr. Manhattan has spent the past 20 years or so away from Earth on a moon of Jupiter called Europa, creating life in his own version of paradise. Right? He created his own version of Adam and Eve, who are, of course, the male and female lookalikes that we see living with Adrian Veidt. He also teleported a manor house across the galaxy from London to Europa, which makes me wonder, by the way, what did that look like from Earth? Like, did this house just vanish in thin air? What would happen if somebody was living in that house at the time of the teleportation? Would they just be in Europa? Like, I know he's omnipotent. I actually think I nailed that. I was going to say I don't know how to pronounce that word, but I think I got it. I understand that, so it's possible, he double-checked while simultaneously teleporting an empty house, but I thought it was interesting. But anyway, we flash back to Dr. Manhattan, or John Osterman, which is his real name, back when he was a little kid, and he and his father are fleeing Nazi Germany. They're in the exact English manner that would later be teleported to Europa because the two owners of the house agreed to house Jews who needed shelter, who were running from, Hitler's reign. John wanders through the house, hears someone coming, hides in the closet, and accidentally catches the man and woman in the house having sex. He says it's the first time he sees love. Now, I heard someone else make this point, so I'm not going to take credit for it, but it is a good point to bring up. Right before all this, he steals an apple from the kitchen, which is, of course, a forbidden fruit like in the story of Adam and Eve. He then sees the models of his future Adam and Eve having sex. And those people later give him a Bible. So it all ties in very nicely. You hear him say how a jar of butterflies inspired him to later create a bubble of atmosphere on Europa. But it appears that everything about this scene would inspire everything about Europa. This is clearly a huge monumental impact on young John, right down to the caring qualities of the people and their desires to live in service of others. Anyway, the two owners of the house sit John down and explain everything to him about creating life and the beauty of love. They make him promise to create something beautiful, and he does. His paradise on Europa. Back to the scene in the bar, John tells Angela that he left that paradise so he could meet her. He loves her and already fell in love with her because he doesn't, experience the concept of before. But when Angela asks about the specific moment, that oh shit, I'm in love moment, he avoids the answer. Now, I said I wasn't going to get into the specific dialogue of all this because I really can't capture how great it is in this sort of recap. I'm not going to do it justice. But the moment Angela tells the story about her parents dying 22 years ago to the day, and Dr. Manhattan, reacting by saying, tonight's the anniversary of your parents' death, to which Angela says, you knew that. You said it before you sat down. And John says, yes, but you just told me now. Like, he still reacts in real time because he's simultaneously learning this information in real time while also sitting down at the table and revealing to Angela that she just told him. Two moments, 20 minutes apart, but occurring at the same exact time, at least from his perspective, relatively the same time. Or the next moment when he says he regrets doing what he did in Vietnam, to which Angela says, then you must have known you were going to regret it before you did it, so why do it in the first place? And John replies, haven't you ever done anything you knew you were going to regret? It's just so sharp, man. This writing was so sharp. Back to the plot, though. Angela quickly realizes that John can blend in, obviously, with the other weirdos wearing blue paint on VVN Day, but the next day he'll stand out like a blue sore thumb. So she devises a solution, one that's actually carried out 2 weeks from this conversation, to have him assume the appearance and identity of a dead person with no next of kin. She goes to the morgue, and they decide on the identity of Cal because, as weird as it may sound with him being a corpse, he clearly is the most handsome choice. And I think that's kind of the tongue-in-cheek, like, oh, well, here's another body to choose from, and she kind of saves him for last. With also saying, like, I don't care what they look like, but clearly she prefers Cal, right? Back to the original conversation in Vietnam. He says that they're together for 10 years, but that it ends tragically, and convinces her that he knows this by predicting that her favorite song is about to play on the jukebox. In a funny moment, she says she's never heard the song before, a song called Tunnel of Love, but that it will become her favorite song. Tunnel of Love is, of course, a symbolic summary for the entire relationship, right? Because there's a light at the end of the tunnel and a light at the beginning of the tunnel, but the middle is darkness. More on that later, though. Actually, let's get to that now. Cal goes to visit Adrian Veidt in his crumbling secret lair. His wall of TVs basically broken down, and he's watching a news report of a reactor meltdown, specifically a nuclear reactor meltdown. He's pissed because this is yet another example of the world not following his instructions post, fake alien attack. Remember the whole documentary that the 7th Cavalry showed to Wade? Well, it seems like that message from Adrian Veidt wasn't taken particularly seriously, and that would be incredibly infuriating to a man like Adrian because in his mind, he just killed millions to save the entire planet. He's the world's smartest man. He knows best, and yet they're not listening. There's actually a particularly funny moment where Adrian tells Dr. Manhattan that taking the form of a black man is quite problematic these days and sort of appropriation, which is just kind of funny. The more important bit, however, comes from John asking, how did you know I was on Europa? And Adrian replies that a little elephant told me. An obvious reference to Lady True. So Lady True knew that Dr. Manhattan was on Europa, and presumably she's the one who has that satellite set up to watch him. I guess either that or Adrian himself. He could have built it after she told him about it. Either way, this fits the theory that he was spelling out Save Me Daughter with all those bodies, right? And Save Me Daughter would be the reveal possibly in the next episode because he would, likely mean that his daughter was Lady True, right? Another theory that's been kind of passed around a lot this season. But ultimately, the largest point of this conversation, the point of this entire meeting really, is that Adrian has a little device, a device that will erase Dr. Manhattan's memory, and thus, if he was never aware of his abilities, he wouldn't be able to use them, or he wouldn't know to use them. He would be effectively mortal. He'd be in the dark. He'd be in a tunnel of love. There you go, bring that back. But of course, his powers could still come out in a reflex capacity, which they did on the White Knight, explaining the very old mystery from episode 1 or 2, that they found one body in the house, despite us clearly having one person come from upstairs and see another one come through the front door. Well, that's because the second body was disintegrated, right? Just vaporized by Dr. Manhattan, a.k.a. Cal Abar. And the kicker is that Adrian actually made this device 30 years ago as a first defense against Dr. Manhattan. The weapon that Adrian, lures John into in the comics, his plan to get rid of him, was actually Plan B, apparently. Now, this has further meaning than this one scene because, remember, Joe Keene's plan is to become a Dr. Manhattan-like being, and Angela is currently in possession of a device that was originally designed as a weapon to stop a Dr. Manhattan-like being. that simply has to play in the season finale. I can't see why they'd introduce all this if it doesn't play, right? In exchange for this gift, John sends Adrian to Europa, and thus we're introduced to our first major paradox of the episode. Well, I guess not counting the line about, humans build bombs because it makes them feel safer. No, the first major paradox of the episode is that Adrian Veidt imprisoned himself while seeking out paradise, no less, right? Irony at its best, or worst, I guess. He never got past that simple fact. He saved the world and nobody knew about it, and it's haunted him. You see, the life that John created was basically waiting for someone to worship, because he had to leave, because their love was infinite and therefore unsatisfying, unlike Angela's, which was limited and with risk. Without risk, what's the point of love in the first place? It's kind of a profound thought, actually. But to the initial conversation, and perhaps the biggest piece of foreshadowing in this entire episode, Angela asks John to create life to prove that he's really Dr. Manhattan. He does so by making an egg appear. She says a chicken would have been better, which obviously leads you to sort of recall that old chicken and the egg paradox. And that comes into play later with Angela and Will. But before all that, he also says that he can give his powers to another person by transferring them to an organic material, an egg, for example, and have someone consume it or eat it. Now, this is big for a few reasons. One is that it presents the idea that another character in 2019 could become Dr. Manhattan if he chooses to allow it. Remember the reference to having kids? He said he would never pass his abilities along to someone without their consent, but he could and would pass them along to a willing participant. Possibly through an egg. Angela phrases the question like, so if I ate this egg, I could walk on water, which is telling, because in that final scene, John walks on water in the pool and says that Angela needed to see this for later. A few moments later, he gets blown up. If John had somehow developed a way to give Angela the Dr. Manhattan powers through an egg, she could walk on water and prove that she has the powers, prove to herself anyway, and ultimately use them to shut down the 7th Cavalry plans and save the world. This also jives with the joke that Laurie told in the beginning about God getting hit with a brick, right? 3 men come before God to be judged, and he sends them all to hell. And the joke, the 3 heroes are Night Owl, Adrian Veidt, or Ozymandias, and Dr. Manhattan. But what God didn't realize was that there's a person he overlooked, someone that he doesn't even recognize or remember, and they had set plans into motion years ago that would ultimately kill him. The little girl in this case could be Angela. Right? The big players here are Adrian Veidt, Lady True, Dr. Manhattan. Joe Keane is the man who seeks to be a god. Perhaps Angela hits him with a metaphorical brick at the end because while the 7th Cavalry all, banded together to destroy Dr. Manhattan, they were never looking to kill Angela. They didn't know to stop her because they didn't know that, she could have these abilities. She was the little girl who was overlooked. This whole egg thing also explains why John drank the egg in that first scene, right? Because you can't have Dr. Manhattan power eggs floating around just for any random person to consume. Not that someone would just drink a random egg out of a beer, but you never know. Now let's break down this final scene back in present day. John is experiencing some confusion due to the device being removed, right? He doesn't know when he is. He walks on the pool water because Angela needed to see it for some reason. He waves to the kids in the window, which at first looks like a friendly, hello. But in reality, he's teleporting them to the Dreamland Theater to be with Angela's grandfather, Will Reeves. Apparently, after meeting with Veidt, but before going back to Angela, John teleported to New York to meet Will Reeves, a.k.a. Hooded Justice. He informed Will that he has a granddaughter and convinces him to be part of her life. It's actually maybe the most beautiful moment of this episode, which is saying something. When John is monologuing to Will with the sort of light piano in the background coming in, Will is doubtful that Angela would want him in her life, right? Because he's become resentful of close relationships in general. We've seen that throughout Will Reeves' life, through the series of memory flashbacks. He says, "What the fuck do you know?" Right? And John then says, "I know the moment I first see her, I sense profound emptiness and loss. I know because she says over and over again that she doesn't want a family, yet it is clear that through her actions, that is all she wants. I know because I'm talking to her right now." And then the big reveal. The killing of Judd Crawford, Will Reeves returning to Tulsa and thrusting himself into her life. It all happened because Angela set it into motion. Angela tells John to ask her grandfather something 10 years in the past because John experiences all these timelines and moments at the same time, right? So John, that was in New York City 10 years ago, can remember this moment from 10 years later in 2019 with Angela and repeat the question she's asking. Does that make sense? So Angela says, ask him, how did he know Judd Crawford was part of Cyclops? Ask him, how did he know that there's a fucking clan robe hidden in his closet? To which Will says, who's Judd Crawford? I mean, goddamn it, what a fucking well-written show. All of this was brought about because future Angela planted the seed in Will Reeves' head 10 years in the past. And they start pumping in the Trent Reznor synth as Angela's kind of coming to this realization. The answer to the chicken and the egg paradox, by the way, as John points out, is that neither was first. The answer is both at exactly the same time. John flashes back to the egg he created during that first meeting with Angela in Vietnam and suddenly decides to make breakfast in the kitchen. This is the moment where I believe that he somehow leaves an organic material for Angela to eat, likely an egg or some version of an egg, while he's making that French toast, thus giving her the ability to become the new Dr. Manhattan and stop Cyclops from destroying the world. As they say, nothing ever ends. John had to let himself be destroyed in order for Angela to sneak up on Cyclops and stop them, probably side by side with her grandfather, once and for all. It's beautiful, really. Storytelling at its finest. Damon Lindelof is the fucking man, plain and simple, and this is the best show of the year. Now let's sit back and enjoy the finale. And a little life lesson for all of you out there. When Angela says, I cannot get serious with someone if I know it's just going to end in tragedy, John says, by definition, don't all relationships end in tragedy, which is true. So get out there, do what Angela does, just say, fuck it, why not? Oh, and of course, because there wasn't any weird Adrian Veidt moments in this episode, they decided to throw a little post-credit sequence into the episode. Apparently, the punishment for trying to leave Europa is for Various, Phillips, and Cruikshanks to ask if he'll stay. When he says no, they smush tomatoes in his face. Back in his jail cell, the game warden delivers a birthday cake to Adrian, who is reading a book called Fog Dancing. It's about loneliness, apparently, and Adrian poses that the game warden can't understand loneliness. The game warden then reveals that he was the original male pulled from the water. He was there when Dr. Manhattan created heaven before his eyes and then left, right? So, of course, he understands loneliness. So why is heaven not enough for Adrian? Well, that's because it's not his home, apparently. His home is 390 miles away, 90 million miles away, sorry, and he has this illusion of grandeur about how all these people on Earth are basically babies standing in their cribs, crying out in desperation for him to return, to save them. Heaven's not enough because heaven doesn't need Adrian, right? This scene ends with Adrian pulling a horseshoe from a cake, maniacally laughing, and frantically digging at the stone floor. Dude, what is it up with this horseshoe? I'm very confused by this. That's the strangest standing mystery to me. How does it all play in? Is it possibly future Adrian speaking to Manhattan, speaking to the Cruikshanks and Phillips in the past situation, like just basically what we just saw with Will and Angela talking to each other through different time periods? Or perhaps Angela Manhattan, if she does in fact gain that circular view of time. You know, someone saves Adrian, who then tells Manhattan to go to the past to inform the clones to put horseshoes in the cake so they can escape prison in the first place. From what we understand, he was sent to Europa 10 years ago, and it looks like there were 7 candles on the cake, you know, signifying the 7th anniversary, meaning he could be digging for the remaining 3 years just to get caught up with the present timeline and come into play in Tulsa during the final episode. Confused yet? Well, that's the point. The next one will bring us home, I promise. If you didn't watch Leftovers, you just got to trust that Lindelof will bring us home. Take care of yourself, guys. Wish me luck on my surgery, and I'll talk to you next week. Peace.